Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture this week on the mechanisms of evolution. We talked about last week how evolution is the change of the genetic makeup of a population, and the mechanisms are the things that cause the change to happen. So we talked about one main one last week. It was highlighted a lot on Wednesday when you looked at that rock pocket mouse. What was that mechanism of evolution that we really hit on last week? Are you thinking of it? If you're thinking natural selection, you're absolutely correct. Natural selection is when the environment dictates which organisms have a favorable trait or have a survival advantage. Those organisms are going to survive, reproduce, and pass on that particular trait in the population, and that will go on until that trait is no longer favorable in the environment. So we're going to talk today about some more mechanisms of evolution. And you're going to need knowledge of these mechanisms of evolution for the activity you're going to do on Wednesday this week. So looking at our mechanisms, we're going to talk about mutations today. And we talked about these already during the school year, so it'll be a quick review of them, but how they pertain to evolution. We're going to talk about gene flow, which is a new thing for you. We're going to talk about genetic drift, which is new as well. And we're going to highlight or review natural selection as it is one of the main mechanisms of evolution. All right, so here we go. We'll start with mutations. We know that mutations are a random chance event that create new versions of the DNA. There can be chromosomal mutations like non-disjunction. You guys remember that? One of the things that causes Down syndrome. There can be a simple change to one of the letters of the DNA. But either way, no matter the type of mutation, that's going to introduce variation or differences, diversity in the genetic makeup of a population. And we know that it's random. They're constantly appearing. We can't control mutations. It could be something as simple as, like in this picture, the mutagen is the UV light. And because of that mutagen, it changed the letter of the DNA. Instead of a thymine, changed it to an adenine. So now you have a different sequence of the DNA. And why is that important? Well, I want you to think back to transcription and translation, right? If you change the DNA, you're changing the mRNA in transcription, and therein you're changing the amino acid sequence in translation, and you get a different protein. You guys remember with protein, structure equals function. We talked about hemoglobin, right? The protein that carries oxygen around the body. I talked to you guys about sickle cell anemia, how sickle cell anemia is one change of one letter in the DNA, which causes a different amino acid, which causes the red blood cells to be that crescent moon shape or that sickle shape. I drew a picture on the board if you guys can think back to when that happened when we were all in school together. These are some of the mutations that we talked about in school. Here's the original DNA sequence. A missense mutation is when you change one of the letters of the DNA and that gives you a different amino acid in the sequence. A nonsense mutation, changing one of the letters and then gives you an early stop codon, UAG, in the sequence. That's going to make the protein non-functional. And then the silent mutation, if you switch one of the letters of the DNA but it stays the same, you still end up with arginine or the same amino acid in the sequence. These are the different kinds of substitution mutations that we talked about. We also talked about insertions and deletions. We talked about how they're frame shift mutations. You should remember all that stuff. I think that might have been one of the last tests we took, right? Before all this happened. So anyway, tying this all back to evolution, mutations are going to introduce new versions of genes by changing the structure of the protein, which there changes the function. Sometimes it's helpful, right? Like in the case of the rock pocket mouse, getting the different color to survive and camouflage itself against the background. Sometimes it's harmful, like in the case of sickle cell anemia with the crescent shape red blood cells that aren't able to carry the oxygen as effectively or efficiently. So it really depends. We talked about, or you talked about and saw on Wednesday, how mutations can be harmful, they can be helpful, or they can be totally neutral and have no effect, kind of like our silent mutation here. All right, so we're going to stick with, throughout our little discussion today, a population of beetles. So imagine that in the first generation, you have beetles that are all green in color. So your frequency of the green allele, 2 out of 2, or they make up 100% of the population, no brown alleles in the population. These two beetles mate. Now you have offspring that are brown in color. So now you've introduced a new color into the population. This could be very well from a mutation that occurred, a mutation that now gives a brown phenotype, or now you have a brown allele in the population. So from generation 1 to generation 2, the genetic makeup of the population has changed, and you can see that from these allele frequencies. So mutation changes the genetic makeup of the population, which is our definition of evolution. Gene flow. new thing that you haven't talked about yet, or maybe don't remember from middle school, maybe you didn't learn it. Gene flow is another mechanism of evolution. It's another thing that causes evolution to occur. The definition of gene flow is the movement of individuals and alleles in and out of populations. When you think of gene flow, you should think of migration, right? Organisms migrate from one place to another, and when they do that, they can sometimes come across other populations of organisms, and they can introduce, if they decide to interbreed with them, introduce their genetics into that population and change the genetic makeup of that already existing population. So let's look at some examples. Seed and pollen distribution by wind and insects. So here's a bee landing on a pink flower, a light pink flower. When the bee lands, it picks up pollen, that stuff that's driving us all crazy this time of year with allergies, right? Picks up pollen and flies over to another type of flower that is darker pink in color. When it lands, it drops off the pollen that it picked up from this flower, and now that pollen is going to fertilize and make new flowers. So the alleles, or the genetic material from this flower was transferred over to this flower. That's gene flow, introducing new alleles into this population of dark pink flowers. Great example down here at the bottom too with birds. You have two separate populations of birds. They live on different sides of the river, so they're interbreeding with each other on this side of the river, interbreeding with each other on this side of the river. But just by chance, one of these birds decides to fly over across the river and meet up with these other birds that it's never met before, and now it's going to introduce its alleles into this population of birds. So this population of birds had all homozygous dominant genotypes. This population had all homozygous recessive. When this bird brings its genes over to this population, you're already doing the mental Punnett square, right? It's going to be 100% chance of having heterozygous offspring, but now you've introduced the recessive allele into this group of birds when it wasn't there before. So that's gene flow, genetic mixing, you can think of it, like I have underlined in red here. Genetic mixing, it's going to sometimes help populations by increasing the genetic variety. Sometimes if this trait that came over here is not helpful on this side of the river, it can reduce the survivability of those organisms. It really depends on the situation, but that's gene flow. Think of organisms coming from one place to another and introducing their genetics into a population that's already been established. So here's gene flow going back to our beetles. You have a population of brown beetles and you have a population of green beetles. One of the beetles from the brown population decides to leave, and it travels over to the green beetles where it's now going to interbreed and introduce its own genetics into that population. And now you're going to have the brown allele in the green population of beetles, which it wasn't there before. So this is gene flow. Next, we're talking about genetic drift. So genetic drift is our third mechanism of evolution that we're going to highlight today. Genetic drift is a random chance event. So when you think genetic drift, you should think random thing that happens. So we'll talk about why we call it that. There are two types of genetic drift. There's one called the founder effect, and we're going to look at that in this picture here. Now picture for a minute here that this island has no birds on it. Okay, just picture that for a second. Blank island. This is the mainland where you have a population of these birds all living together, all same species. Some of them are yellow, some of them are red. That's just that genetic variety that exists already in the population. Just by random chance, two of these red birds decide to fly over to this empty island and start interbreeding and making offspring. Now, you're going to have a new population of birds on this island that wasn't here before, and they're all red in color. It was just totally random chance that these two red birds decided to fly over to the island and make offspring together. It could have easily have been two yellow birds, could have been a yellow and a red bird, just so happened to be two red birds. And with that, now you have a new population of organisms whose genetic makeup is all carrying the red allele. So this is a random chance event where just so happened that these particular organisms in the population traveled to a new place and started a new population that has this particular genetic makeup. What's different between genetic drift and gene flow is that gene flow would be if there were already birds here, and this red bird came over and introduced its alleles into an established population. Genetic drift, the founder effect, founder meaning it's the first one, right? That's when you start a new population based off of another population, like this picture here. So we're going to go through and look at another type of example, the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect deals in the randomness of genetic drift by thinking of like natural disasters like a fire or a flood. a storm, a drought, something that reduces the genetic variety of a population or has an effect on it somehow. So we're going to look at some examples of that here with two different kinds of organisms. We'll start first with another example of the founder effect. So in this example here, you have a population of flowers. Some are red, some are yellow, some are blue. It just so happens that this bird swoops down and happens to pick up a red and a blue flower. It flies to an open area of grass where there's no flowers, drops the flowers. The seeds from those flowers are going to fall to the ground. They're going to germinate, and now you have a new population of flowers. That's the red and the blue. So you have some members of the original population that came to a new area and now are growing here. But this was random, right? This bird didn't have thought when it went down to scoop up the flowers, right? It wasn't particularly picking out the blue or the yellow ones. It just swooped down and happened to pick up a blue and a yellow and leave the red there. So now your new population has only yellow and blue alleles in its genetic makeup, no red. So this would be the founder effect. This is going to have an impact on the new population or the gene pool of the new population. And gene pool meaning how many of the different alleles you have, how many for red, how many for blue. The bottleneck effect, which we started to talk about a minute ago, is usually when a large disaster or something like that reduces the genetic population of, or genetic frequency of a population. So it's going to be, again, like famine, natural disaster, loss of habitat. This is a random chance event that's going to eliminate certain members of a population by no fault of their own, usually. So this is going to be something that's going to affect organisms on a random scale and not necessarily due to fitness. So for example, if there is a fire and it's in a forest somewhere and several deer die, it's not going to be that, certain deer that had a different shade of fur color survive better than others. If it's a fire, it's a random chance event. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you would die out. And with you dying out, you take your genes with you. So now you're not going to pass those alleles into the population anymore. So it's going to reduce the genetic variety of the gene pool or limit the number of alleles in the gene pool. And the reason they call it the bottleneck effect is because if you think of a bottle, here's our parent population of organisms. We have red, blue, and yellow, just like in the flower example. If you tip a bottle over, right, only so many can fit through the neck of the bottle. So through the neck of the bottle come only the blue and yellow marbles, just like with our flowers. So after some sort of natural disaster, the red ones have all been eliminated. Say again, like my fire example. They just happened to not make it. It wasn't by any fault of their own. They just didn't come through the neck of the bottle. So now you have more organisms surviving that are blue, not as many yellow, but after these organisms reproduce with one another, now your next generation is going to look like this. So this is a pretty big or pretty drastic genetic makeup change, right? Whereas we had this many organisms before and we had the three colors represented, now we have an over-representation of the blue in the population, not as many of the yellow, and certainly no red. So this is a change in the genetic makeup of the population, again, by a random chance event. Could have been a fire, flood, storm, famine, drought, you name it. I have an example here up top. This is a northern elephant seal. If you wanted to read more about them, you could click on this link below. But the northern elephant seals have a reduced genetic variation because of humans. Humans hunted them a lot in the late 1800s. That reduced their population size down to 20 individual elephant seals. And their population did rebound after the hunting to 30,000, but because it got down to so few of them, only 20 members of the population left, that greatly reduces the number of alleles in the population, or that genetic variety that's there. So now you have a lot of these elephant seals, after they've rebounded, a lot of them have the same alleles. There's not as much genetic variation in the population. Whereas there are also southern elephant seals. They were not as intensely hunted around that time, and they have a lot of genetic variation in their society or in their population. What's bad about that, in this case of the elephant seal, if you don't have a lot of members of the population with different genetics, that means you're all susceptible to things in the population or in the environment changing, disease, famine, right? We've talked about things like that. If everybody has the same genetics, then everybody's on the same playing field, right? Nobody has a survival advantage over another. Here's another example with the Florida panther. The Florida panther has been heavily hunted by humans. Its habitat has been devastated by humans. So the Florida panther is actually on the endangered species list. We have hunted it near extinction levels. And the reason this is a bottleneck effect example is that when hunters are, lying in wait to kill these organisms, they're not sitting there going, I wonder if that panther has all the homozygous dominant alleles inside of it. I better shoot it, right? No, they're just randomly killing these organisms if they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that's greatly reducing the genetic variety of the Florida panther and thus putting them on the extinction or close to extinction. But you can read more about that too. So that's the Florida story of the Florida panther. These are both examples of bottleneck effects. This one rebounded with less genetic variation. This one is looking like it may not rebound and may become extinct. So here's genetic drift with our beetles. So say you're out for your walk, right? Everybody's going for walks these days, or I hope you are, at least one a day to get some exercise, get out in the fresh air. You have your population of beetles on the ground. Some are green, some are brown. You're walking along and you just, happen to step, I guess you're wearing your dress shoes and dress pants on this walk. You just happen to step on the green beetles in the population. It was just random chance, right, that those beetles got stepped on by you. You were walking along, listening to music. You weren't paying attention. You didn't intentionally seek out these green beetles and try to kill them. This is a random chance event. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now you have changed the genetic makeup of the population. Before, you had 3 out of 9 of the total alleles in the population being the green color, and now you have even less. You only have 1 of the organisms left that has the green allele. So now your genetic frequency has greatly changed from the first generation to the next. So this is genetic drift, a random chance event that caused evolution to occur. So unlike natural selection, this is totally random, whereas natural selection has more of a logic to it, if you will. This is when the environment determines which organisms will likely survive and which alleles will accumulate in high populations in that environment. So this random chance, right? This dictated by the environment. So here's our rock pocket mice again on the different lava flows, right? Depending on what color they are, they're going to have a survival advantage. They're not going to get picked off. So you're going to have a lot of the light color allele in the population that's living on the light colored lava flows. You're going to have a lot of the dark allele on the dark lava flows. Same thing with the pepper moth. Very similar idea here, right? Light and dark. So you have a fitness, or you have organisms that are better fit for the environment. They're the ones that are going to have increased numbers of their allele in the population. So you should be good with natural selection, but of course let me know if you're still struggling with it. And here's our beetles again. Green and brown in the population. You have a bird that comes along and picks out the green allele or the green beetle. You could say that maybe these guys were down on the ground. The ground is, has dirt, brown. These guys are blending in better. These guys are standing out. So the bird picks them off. Now you have a change in the population after the first generation, where the brown beetles, because they have a survival advantage, they're able to blend in a lot better. Their frequency of the brown allele is going to increase in the population, and the green is going to decrease. All right, so with all of that, we're going to tie all of our beetle talk into these different mechanisms of evolution and look at how that would apply in multiple scenarios. So kick back, relax, and enjoy.
Variation is found in human populations and in other populations, such as this population of island beetles. Color in these beetles is determined by different versions of a gene, different alleles. Green is the dominant trait, so green beetles have 2 green alleles, or a green allele and a brown allele. Brown beetles have 2 brown alleles. By counting the brown alleles and green alleles, we can calculate that this population has 30% brown alleles and 70% green alleles. The frequency of brown alleles is greater than the frequency of brown beetles because some green beetles have a brown allele. Allele frequencies change as populations evolve. What causes populations to evolve? The island is suffering from a drought. And in this dry environment, brown beetles are better camouflaged than green beetles. Birds are more likely to see and eat green beetles. Over time, Brown beetles survive and reproduce more than green beetles. This is an example of natural selection. Individuals with inherited traits better suited to their environment survive and produce more offspring than other individuals. Here, natural selection causes the frequency of the brown allele to increase. Through natural selection, the population has become better adapted to its new environment. Genetic drift occurs when populations evolve due to chance events. Let's see how genetic drift affects this small population of beetles. Chance constantly affects which beetles actually reproduce and which of their alleles they pass on. In a small population, chance events produce large fluctuations in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. Here, the frequency of the brown allele has decreased to 0, and the population is left with only green beetles. Genetic drift also occurs in large populations. But in a large population, genetic drift has less effect because it causes much smaller fluctuations in allele frequencies. Other random events can also lead to genetic drift. By chance, this volcano kills more brown beetles than green beetles, causing the frequency of the green allele to increase. Gene flow describes evolution due to individuals moving into or out of a population. When green and brown beetles migrate into the all-green population, the frequency of the brown allele increases. Natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow are the major mechanisms responsible for the evolution of all populations. Together, they shape populations of beetles as well as humans.
All right, so that's it for our discussion on the mechanisms of evolution. You're going to need this information for the activity again that you're doing on Wednesday. I'm going to post this for you. Don't forget that if you are one of the first half of your classmates to comment on this thread for today, you're going to pose a question about the material in this lecture. And if you're in the second group of people who post a comment, you're going to respond with an answer to one of those posted questions. All right, thank you everyone. Have a great day.